Come here. Closer, so I might see your face. When I look at you, I see nothing of the king. Only that whore, your mother. My father never did anything so well as to cut off her head.
Your Majesty forgets he was also my father.
Why will you not confess your crimes against me?
Because, Your Majesty, I have committed none.
You speak with such sincerity. I see you are still a consummate actress. My husband is gone. They have poisoned my child. They say it is a tumor. Oh.
Madam, you are not well.
They say this cancer will make you queen, but they are wrong. Look there. It is your death warrant. All I need do is sign it.
Mary, if you sign that paper, you will be murdering your own sister. You will promise me something? When I am gone, you will do everything in your power to uphold the Catholic faith. Do not take away from the people the consolations of the Blessed Virgin, their Holy Mother. When I am queen, I promise to act as my conscience dictates.
In a world overflowing with movies, we need a hero. Someone to separate the bad from the good.
Sounds like a job. Verbal dioramas. Watches all the movies from comedy to drama. From the top row sound. And don't forget the action. She'll watch until the end and then she'll give you her reaction. Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequels, sequels, remakes, and trivia and outtake. Movies you know, movies you don't. Interesting stories, all the categories.
Hi everyone, I'm Em and welcome to Verbal Diorama, episode 291, Elizabeth. This is the podcast that's all about the history and legacy of movies you know and movies you don't. That may be a woman, Sir William, but if I choose, I have the heart of a man. I am my father's daughter. I am not afraid of anything. As always, welcome to Verbal Diorama, whether you are a brand new listener to this podcast, whether you are a regular returning listener, welcome back to this podcast. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast. Out of all of the movie podcasts you could possibly be listening to right now, I am so happy to have you here for the history and legacy of Elizabeth. And just FYI, I am currently recovering from a bit of a cold, so my voice isn't working as well as it usually is. So it's a little bit husky today. I do apologise if my voice doesn't sound the same as it normally does. And I'm going to be editing out all the coughing that I'm doing during this episode. But of course, I wanted to get this episode recorded as soon as I possibly could because it is Women's History Month. And this month on Verbal Diorama is celebrating women from all walks of life, from warriors to queens to single mothers and to women in sport. Last week, we had the story of the warrior women of Dahomey, the Agoge. And this week's being a bit more English, a bit more Tudor. Huge thank you to everyone who listens to this podcast, has continued to listen and support this podcast over the last 6 years. It means so much to have your support, and I really genuinely am very grateful that you are listening to this podcast. And even I can tell that my voice isn't right. So I'm hoping that this record comes out okay. But one of the reasons that I wanted to cover Women's History Month is obviously as a woman myself. In podcasting and just generally as a woman, I am inspired by all sorts of women from all different cultures, all religions, all professions. And it made complete sense to me to focus on women in film. And not only women in film, but true stories of women put to film. Because that's what Women's History Month is all about. It's all about celebrating those true stories of the women who came before us and who inspire us, and basically who shaped the world for women like me and girls today in 2025. Now, if you've listened to my previous episode on The Woman King, you'll remember I mentioned the heavy criticism it got for being inaccurate. But the movie Elizabeth said, hold my beer, because there are things in this movie that either didn't happen at all or didn't happen at the start of her reign when this movie is depicted. I find this movie completely fascinating. I absolutely love this movie. I think it is great. I think Cate Blanchett is great. But let's go into it, inaccuracies and all. Here's the trailer for Elizabeth.
By order of their gracious majesties, Queen Mary and King Philip, we are come to witness the burning of these Protestant heretics who have denied the authority of the one true Catholic Church and of His Holiness the Pope. Let them burn for all eternity.
Your Grace, Protestants are already returning from abroad.
Yes, and have made plans to massacre every Catholic in England.
Will you leave your kingdom to a heretic?
The Queen is dead. Long live the Queen!
Elizabeth, Queen of England. A court to worship you, a country to obey you, poems written celebrating your beauty, music composed in your honor, and they will be nothing to you.
Your Majesty should know that you have inherited a most parlous and degenerate state. It's threatened from abroad by the ambitions of France and Spain and is weaker in strength, in men, monies and riches than I have ever known it.
Why we must tear ourselves apart for this small question of religion?
Surely, my lords, it is better to have a single Church of England.
Madam, the bishops are against you and have no fear of you. They do not expect you to survive.
Your Majesty would improve all these matters if you would agree to marry.
I may be a woman, but if I choose, I have the heart of a man. I will have one mistress here, and no master.
Let it all be done.
Her Majesty's body and person are no longer her own property. They belong to the state.
I am my father's daughter. I am not afraid of anything.
Innocence is the most precious thing you possess. Lose that, and you lose your soul.
When her Catholic half-sister, Queen Mary I, dies, the line of succession goes to Elizabeth, the Protestant half-sister Mary was not prepared to execute. The new queen finds herself surrounded by advisors, some supportive, but some plotting to restore the Catholic line by almost any means. She's also under pressure to marry and produce an heir, but her lover, Lord Robert Dudley, is not considered suitable. Elizabeth realises she has some decisions to make, the most important being the running of her beloved England. Let's run through the cast of this movie. We have Cate Blanchett as Queen Elizabeth I, Geoffrey Rush as Francis Walsingham, Joseph Fiennes as Robert Dudley, the 1st Earl of Leicester, Richard Attenborough as William Cecil, 1st Baron Burghley, Christopher Eccleston as Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk, James Frayne as Alvaro de la Quadra, Eric Cantona as Paul de Foix, Vincent Cassel as Henry, Duke of Anjou, Kathy Burke as Queen Mary I, Fanny Ardant as Mary of Guise, Emily Mortimer as Kat Ashley, Kelly MacDonald as Isabel Knollys, Jamie Foreman as the Earl of Sussex, Daniel Craig as John Ballard, and John Gielgud as Pope Pius V. Elizabeth was written by Michael Hurst and directed by Shekhar Kapur. So as I mentioned, the last episode of this podcast was on The Woman King, a truly incredible historical epic that is a must-watch if you've not seen it, and then the episode is then a must-listen, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. But that movie got quite a lot of criticism levied towards it for historical inaccuracy. It's true the movie doesn't exactly represent the true horrors of the Atlantic slave trade happening at the time, but the timeline is at least fairly accurate to the Kingdom of Dahomey in 1823. So we move on to Elizabeth, from the woman king to the virgin queen. Or was she? The movie does seem to suggest otherwise. Good for her. But as a wholly British podcast with a British host, who used to live in the town where Queen Elizabeth I famously visited Robert Dudley for a 19-day party, I feel like I am somewhat qualified to tell the story of Elizabeth and how an Indian and an Australian came together to tell a lavish, dynamic version of the story, full of the emotions and essence of history, as Shekhar Kapur put it. Elizabeth, the real queen, has mostly been revered throughout history as not only one of our country's longest-serving monarchs, with a 44-year, 127-day reign, she was also the last Tudor monarch, and her reign and its effect on history and culture would lead to an entire era being named after her, the Elizabethan. Unlike her father, whose history has been somewhat revisioned throughout, Elizabeth's has not. While during his reign he was feared and adored, Henry VIII was actually a bit of a swine, and so modern historians tend to focus more on the many negative things he did, such as his many wives and divorcing, beheading, died, divorcing, beheading, survived. But Henry VIII's reign did ultimately influence Elizabeth's. She had no memory of her mother, Anne Boleyn, who was beheaded for adultery when Elizabeth was 2 years old. Like her father, she was highly intelligent. Unlike him, she was vivacious and energetic. She was fluent in 6 languages, including Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. She once remarked to an ambassador that she knew many languages better than her own. She was educated in theology, history, philosophy, and rhetoric, and was an accomplished sportswoman. She wasn't quite the wallflower the movie makes her out to be. Henry VIII was the one who originally broke from Rome to annul his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon to marry Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. This decision was retracted when his Catholic eldest daughter, Mary I, ascended the throne. Mary was known to have executed 300 heretics and was referred to as Bloody Mary. She was 37 when she became queen. She was the first queen to become queen in her own right and not as queen consort, marrying Philip II of Spain the following year, purely to secure the Catholic reign, but also in order to prevent Elizabeth, a Protestant, to ever become queen. At this point, Elizabeth was imprisoned in 1554 and spent a year under house arrest. Under the Third Succession Act, passed in 1543 by the Parliament of England, Elizabeth was recognised as Mary's heir, unless Mary were to have a child. In 1555, Elizabeth returned to court to await and witness the impending birth of Mary's child. However, Mary wasn't pregnant. In 1558, after another phantom pregnancy, Elizabeth became queen upon Mary's death on the 17th of November 1558. It's worth adding at this point that the timeline of this movie is heavily compressed and rearranged. Events that occurred over many years are presented as happening within a short period. It simplifies years of intricate diplomatic and religious manoeuvring into a more straightforward dramatic confrontation. Some events in this movie just didn't happen at all. So, let's go through quickly what is fact and what is fiction in this movie. Robert Dudley was indeed Elizabeth's favourite and one of her most trusted advisors and friends. He never betrayed her by being secretly married, nor did he commit treason by working with the Spanish ambassador. In reality, he remained one of her most trusted advisors throughout her reign, as she knew of his marriage to Amy Dudley. Amy Dudley actually died in mysterious circumstances in 1560, and there were rumours that Elizabeth knew, and that she would consider marrying Dudley should his wife die. After Amy Dudley's violent death, though, Elizabeth couldn't risk her reputation by marrying him. Whether they did sleep together or not, we'll never truly know for sure, but the movie makes it clear that she did, and then chose to reclaim her virginity by being married to England. In reality, the rumours of her entanglement with Dudley were damaging and almost cost her the throne. No man is worth that hassle, not even Joseph Fiennes in a flowing shirt. Many historians think that the whole Virgin Queen title was literally just branding, that maybe Elizabeth was the influencer of her day, and that it was all just clever Tudor propaganda. There were rumours Elizabeth did have children too, and several people were imprisoned for suggesting she had. Author Henry Hawkins said of Robert Dudley in 1581, quote, that my Lord Robert hath 5 children by the Queen, and she never goeth in progress but to be delivered, unquote, meaning that her many tours of the country were to hide her pregnancies. Many unwanted royal children were brought up in the houses of noblemen as changeling children. Usually this happened by male monarchs. But who's to say that Elizabeth also didn't do the same? Many historians, though, believe she did indeed remain childless for her entire life. William Cecil wasn't an elderly man. He was only 13 years older than Elizabeth. His support for her was kept secret, but he was also the administrator of her lands, so they didn't need to meet in secret. Elizabeth never forced him into retirement. Him becoming Lord Burghley wasn't for his retirement, and the following year he was given more power at court as Lord Treasurer. Similarly, Cate Ashley, Elizabeth's chief lady-in-waiting, wasn't her age, but actually older than Elizabeth, and was a mother figure rather than a friend. Isabel Knollys and Lettice Howard didn't exist, but Lettice Knollys did. She ended up marrying Robert Dudley. There was no poison dress, it was entirely fabricated. Holding for applause there. While Elizabeth did have assassination plots against her, mostly to remove her as queen in favour of her Catholic cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, nothing ever materialised. Okay, I'll stop now. Most people had her death as a par for the course, and there were plenty of opportunities to do it, like the Northern Earls Rebellion of 1569, the Ridolfi Plot of 1571, the Throckmorton Plot of 1583, and the Babington Plot of 1585. The Duke of Norfolk did plan to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, and he ended up imprisoned, but on his release he became embroiled in another plot to dethrone Elizabeth, and he was executed for it. Francis Walsingham was exiled as a Protestant and returned as a minor politician before becoming Elizabeth's spymaster about 10 years into her reign. He did dissolve numerous plots against the Queen, including one which saw the execution of the Duke of Norfolk, but he didn't murder Mary of Guise. She fell suddenly ill and died of dropsy, which is basically fluid retention. Mary of Guise was related to the Duke of Anjou, but very distantly. Henry, Duke of Anjou, who would become King Henry III of France, never actually travelled to England to court the Queen. That honour fell instead to his younger brother Francois, who became Duke of Anjou in 1576, and was the only one of Elizabeth's many suitors to court her in person. But this happened much later in Elizabeth's reign, when she was 46 and he was 24. And Elizabeth did not shave her head, put on white makeup, and begin England's golden age dressed as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. 4 years into her reign, she caught smallpox, and the scarring was so bad she covered it with white makeup, which was actually carcinogenic. The actual golden age came 30 years into her reign, with the defeat of the Spanish Armada, or alternatively, in 2007, with the release of the sequel, Elizabeth the Golden Age. Now, of course, all of this doesn't mean that everything isn't accurate, though. The general political tension between Catholics and Protestants at the time is simplified but fairly true to life. The threat from Frances Mary of Guise and of a possible overthrow by her daughter Mary Queen of Scots was a real concern during Elizabeth's early reign. There was heavy pressure from the court and Elizabeth's closest advisors to marry and produce an heir as soon as possible, with her late half-sister Mary's widower, the Catholic Philip II of Spain, one of the frontrunners. Elizabeth was seen to be considering the offers of marriage, but she knew that as soon as she took a husband, her power would be immediately diminished, which is exactly what had happened to her elder sister Mary. The excommunication from the Vatican was a response to Elizabeth's religious policies over more than a decade, rather than an immediate reaction to her coronation, as depicted in the movie. England was excommunicated by Pope Pius V in 1570, about 12 years into Elizabeth's reign. This declared her illegitimate as queen, released her subjects from any allegiance to her, and encouraged Catholics to depose her. There was basically a bounty on Elizabeth's head from the head of the Catholic Church. The excommunication came after Elizabeth had already established the Protestant Church of England and implemented religious settlements that restored Protestant practices after her Catholic sister Mary's reign. It had significant consequences for English Catholics, though, forcing them to choose between religious loyalty to Rome and political loyalty to the Queen. It also increased tensions between England and Catholic powers like Spain, contributing to the political climate that eventually led to the Spanish Armada in 1588. The woman king doesn't look quite so inaccurate now, right? I'm being a little facetious here, but my point being historical accuracy isn't something movies like this are particularly known for. Michael Hurst was tasked with writing a biographical historical drama, but it also had to be compelling and interesting, so some events were made up, some were moved around, but the focus was always on Elizabeth and how she grew into becoming the influential queen she became. Director Shekhar Kapur was known for his cult classic debut Masoom in 1983, and then gained widespread international recognition with Bandit Queen, the biographical action-adventure about infamous Indian bandit and politician Phulan Devi. He openly admitted he wasn't interested in the history of Queen Elizabeth, but more on the emotional and psychological truth of Elizabeth's situation than with strict historical accuracy. Kapur has spoken about how his own background as an Indian director gave him a different perspective on England's religious history. He has suggested that coming from outside of Britain allowed him to approach the material without some of the ingrained cultural attitude that might influence British filmmakers. Kapur admitted to deliberately using religious imagery and iconography throughout the film to show the blending of politics and religion in Tudor England, and also to highlight Elizabeth's own transformation into a figure who incorporated elements of both Protestant and Catholic visual symbolism in crafting her image as the Virgin Queen. But of course, the casting of Elizabeth herself was the most crucial decision that Kapur and casting directors Simone Ireland and Vanessa Pereira had to make. Emily Watson was first choice for the role, but she turned it down to star in Hilary and Jackie. Kapur saw a trailer for the movie Oscar and Lucinda and lead actress Cate Blanchett. Blanchett was primarily known in her native Australia for her theatre work and smaller film and TV roles. This was Blanchett's international breakthrough role, and her performance earned her an Academy Award nomination. The production took a risk on the relatively unknown Blanchett, which, as always with Cate Blanchett, paid off tremendously. Generally speaking, if you go to a Cate Blanchett movie, you know she's going to be great at the very least, even in Borderlands. And the idea of an Indian director and an Australian lead actor might have caused a few raised eyebrows in the British film industry. The idea that they could fully be able to tell a very English story, especially with Kapur openly not being that interested in the actual history. But Kapur cleverly filled the rest of the cast with great British film and theatre actors, bringing gravitas to the sometimes smaller roles, like legendary stage and screen actor Sir John Gielgud as Pope Pius V, and the excellent Kathy Burke as Queen Mary. Even Eric Cantona, famous French footballer, got in there as Paul de Foix. But mostly it was having Geoffrey Rush, who would also star in Shakespeare in Love that year too, as Francis Walsingham, who is just excellent in this movie. Christopher Eccleston isn't given much to do as the Duke of Norfolk, but Kapur told him to just walk menacingly, so he walks a lot. There's also a blink and you'll miss it cameo from British pop star Lily Allen, who was 12 at the time, as one of Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting, and also her brother, actor Alfie Allen, best known for his role as Theon Greyjoy in Game of Thrones as Arundel's son. Their mother, Alison Owen, was one of the producers of this movie. So principal photography began on the 2nd of September 1997 and finished on the 2nd of December 1997. The recurring motif of the movie was, shall we say, style over substance, if substance was historical accuracy. The production designer was John Meyer, who crafted a distinctive visual approach that balanced historical atmosphere with artistic interpretation. Rather than aiming for perfect period accuracy, Meyer developed a stylized Tudor world. The buildings were medieval rather than typically Tudor, with stone walls instead of wood beams. But the film did use authentic historical locations wherever possible. Durham Cathedral provided the massive stone corridors and interiors that represented parts of Westminster, while Haddon Hall in Derbyshire served as one of Elizabeth's residences. York Minster and Alnwick Castle were also featured prominently. And the interiors were deliberately designed to feel cold and imposing. The production team used a lot of stone and dark woods, and often emphasised the height and scale of rooms to make Elizabeth seem vulnerable, especially in the early scenes of the movie. As the film progresses and Elizabeth gains power, the spaces she occupies begin to feel slightly smaller and more controlled. Many of the costumes, while again highly stylised, are based on period sources and portraits, most famously Elizabeth's coronation portrait. The costume designer was Alexandra Byrne. She would end up earning an Academy Award nomination for her work on this movie. Byrne used costumes not just for historical context, but also as a visual language to tell Elizabeth's story of transformation from a vulnerable young woman to a powerful monarch through deliberate colour progression and design evolution. At the beginning of the movie, Elizabeth wears soft fabrics and light colours, reflecting her relative naivety and innocence, as well as a pretty carefree life, just being the young Elizabeth. She can frolic in fields with her ladies and frolic in rooms with Robert Dudley. Her costumes at the start are more relaxed in style and less regal and proper. After Elizabeth becomes queen, the political pressures mount on the character and her costumes become more structured and formal. The colours deepen to rich reds and darker tones, symbolising both her growing power and the political danger she's almost always in. The final transformation into the Virgin Queen is a structured white gown with an elaborate rough collar. Her face is painted white with a bright red wig, creating the iconic image that would define her reign. This costume is deliberately reminiscent of religious iconography, particularly the Virgin Mary, visually reinforcing Elizabeth's declaration that she is now married to England. Director Shekhar Kapur would comment on the criticism of the portrayal of Catholics in the movie, that he was portraying specific political threats to Elizabeth rather than making a statement about Catholicism as a whole. He viewed the Catholic conspirators in the film as political opponents first and religious figures second. But that didn't mean that many Catholics weren't particularly happy with the depictions of Catholics in this movie. And there never is an easy way to segue into the obligatory Keanu reference, unless I state that Keanu is not Catholic, and so therefore wouldn't have been offended by the Catholic representation in this movie. But this is a part of the podcast where I linked the movie that I'm featuring with Keanu Reeves for no reason other than Keanu is the best of men and would have been a great advisor to Elizabeth I. And really the easiest way to link Keanu to this movie is that Keanu starred with Elizabeth herself, Cate Blanchett, in Sam Raimi's 2000 supernatural thriller The Gift, which I have not seen, but I'm guessing it's yet another phenomenal Cate Blanchett performance. So if you have seen The Gift, then let me know, what do you think of Cate Blanchett's performance, and is it similarly phenomenal to everything else that that woman does? Because Cate Blanchett is terrific, and obviously so is Keanu Reeves. The score for Elizabeth was composed by David Hirschfelder, and it would go on to win the BAFTA Award for Best Film Music and be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Original Dramatic Score, which it would lose to the score for Life is Beautiful. Elizabeth premiered in September 1998 at the Venice Film Festival and had its UK premiere on the 2nd of October 1998. It premiered in the US on the 13th of October 1998. It opened wide in the UK on the 23rd of October 1998 and opened in a limited release in 9 cinemas on the 6th of November 1998 in the US. It increased to a peak of 555 cinemas across the US after several weeks. It wouldn't peak higher than 8 in the US box office chart, but it did do well over the Thanksgiving weekend of 1998. On its $30 million budget, Elizabeth grossed $30.1 million domestically in the US and $52.1 million worldwide for an $82.2 million worldwide gross. Elizabeth also has a score of 84% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it summarises it as no mere historical drama. Elizabeth is a rich, suspenseful journey into the heart of British royal politics and features a typically outstanding performance from Cate Blanchett. It did receive some criticism for historical accuracy, as well as accusations of anti-Catholicism, depicting the Pope as scheming and other Catholic characters as dark, cruel, and devious. But we need to move on to awards season, because 1998 was the only year that 2 performers were nominated for Academy Awards for playing the same character in 2 different films. So we had Cate Blanchett, who was nominated for Best Actress for portraying Elizabeth I in this film, and we had Judi Dench, nominated for Best Actress in a Supporting Role for playing Queen Elizabeth I in Shakespeare in Love. Judi Dench won her Best Actress in a Supporting Role for her playing Elizabeth I, but Cate Blanchett would not win for her role in playing Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Actress, Cate Blanchett, Best Art Direction, Best Cinematography, Best Costume Design, Best Makeup, and Best Original Dramatic Score. It would only win for Best Makeup. It would lose Best Cinematography to Saving Private Ryan, Best Original Dramatic Score, as I've said, to Life is Beautiful, and everything else to Shakespeare in Love. And here's the thing, I really like Shakespeare in Love. I think it's a fun movie and I think it's really great. I've done an episode on Shakespeare in Love. That's how much I like the movie Shakespeare in Love. But if you compare the two, there really is no comparison. The performances of Gwyneth Paltrow in Shakespeare in Love and Cate Blanchett in Elizabeth, Cate Blanchett is so much better in Elizabeth. But there is a huge story behind Shakespeare in Love and why it won so many awards. So have a listen to the episode that I did on Shakespeare in Love. It is episode 252 of this podcast, and it does go into all of that story in quite a bit of detail because it involves someone who I very much don't like to talk about on this podcast. But he was instrumental in making sure that Shakespeare in Love won as many Academy Awards as possible. Anyway, Elizabeth would also be nominated for 12 BAFTAs, and it would win 5, including Best Actress and Outstanding British Film. It was nominated for 3 Golden Globes, and Cate Blanchett won the Golden Globe for Best Actress as well. The sequel, Elizabeth the Golden Age, came out in 2007, and in 2017, Shekhar Kapur was working on Elizabeth the Dark Age. He said in an interview with Variety, quote, "It is a futuristic idea that I wrote about Elizabeth in the future, the state of the monarchy and the state of civilization, based on a dystopian view of what will happen in Europe and what will happen in the UK and the Western world, the recall of the monarchy, which was by then dead and gone. Why was the monarchy recalled and what was happening? It is a futuristic idea of why this 18 or 19-year-old girl, who is actually a prostitute, was recalled to the throne," unquote. Now, Elizabeth the Dark Age has seemingly vanished from Warner Brothers' slate, though, so chances are we won't ever see the very weird, very crazy idea that Shekhar Kapur had on screen. While this movie has its inaccuracies, one thing it does remarkably well is highlight the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and frankly how important that reign was to England, and even now the UK as a whole. It's also visually stunning, and Cate Blanchett is a literal queen. And I mean it when I say that if I see Cate Blanchett in a cast, I feel like I know she's at least going to be good, even if the rest of the movie around her isn't. She is one of the greatest actors of her generation for good reason. And it really all stemmed from Elizabeth. She is spirited and beautiful and regal and just embodies the Queen in such a way that she is the visual representation that we all have now for the young Elizabeth. All cheekbones, English rose complexion, fiery strawberry blonde hair. And while she may not be as physically badass as Viola Davis's Naniska was in the last episode's The Woman King, Elizabeth brings her intelligence and her political prowess to the forefront to deal with a society that didn't value her, didn't want her as queen, even though she was technically a princess and then a queen, just because she was a woman and they were men. It may not be completely historically accurate, but Elizabeth is empowering and feels modern in how she has to work 10 times as hard as any man to be listened to. Ask any woman in your life. She'll get it. Her sister may have been the first queen in her own right, but Elizabeth showed the world how it was done and didn't want to have to share her power with any king consort. But you believe it from Blanchett's portrayal. Elizabeth was a badass queen. She established a model of pragmatic governance that prioritised stability and national interest over ideological purity. She navigated Catholic and Protestant powers while maintaining England's independence and sovereignty. Her approach to governance, which was consulting advisors while retaining final authority, demonstrated her effective leadership that balanced consultation with decisive action. Under Elizabeth, England began its transformation from a relatively minor European kingdom to a significant naval force. Sir Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe and the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 marked pivotal moments in England's rise as a seafaring nation, setting the stage for its later empire. While most of the attempts to establish overseas colonies during her reign were unsuccessful, the English navy grew, and by the end of her reign, England was the greatest sea power in the world. Culturally, the Elizabethan age represents some of the best and most well-known of English arts and literature. William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and many others produced works that remain cornerstones of English literature. Elizabeth was an active patron of the arts, as she understood their importance in projecting royal power and national identity. Religiously, Elizabeth forged what became known as the Elizabethan settlement, finding a middle path between Catholic and Protestant extremes. This compromise, while imperfect, prevented the kind of devastating religious wars that ravaged continental Europe. The Church of England, as we know it today, owes much to Elizabeth's pragmatic approach to religion. Elizabeth also helped forge a sense of English national identity that transcended religious divide. Her famous Tilbury speech before the Spanish Armada, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king," exemplified how she connected her personal rule with national destiny. Her decision to remain unmarried and rule in her own right, becoming the Virgin Queen, married to England instead of a man, created a powerful political mythology that influenced how monarchy was understood. As I mentioned, she knew her brand. Her reign demonstrated that a woman could rule effectively in her own right and challenged prevailing notions about gender and power. Put simply, England has had notorious, infamous monarchs like Henry VIII, but Queen Elizabeth I was the first in a line of monarchs who modernised and changed the country. I don't think it's a coincidence that the most famous monarchs in English and British history are all queens. Two of them are called Elizabeth. The other is Victoria. The Victorian era was a time of great wealth and power for Great Britain and saw significant scientific and technological development. And obviously the late Queen Elizabeth II may not have overseen a massive empire, but she navigated the country through post-war Britain and became the national symbol for the keep calm and carry on aesthetic. Watching this movie, it's easy to see how life here in Britain could have been so very different had Elizabeth either not ascended to the throne or had anything happened during her reign to overthrow her. We might have easily become a Catholic country again. There would be no Church of England. She could have easily married and had an heir, and the royal family would look very different. She could have married the King of Spain, and we could still be in a historic alliance with the Spanish. Who knows? Our lives today in the UK are so intrinsically linked to Elizabeth's reign, and this movie is a great interpretation of that life. Basically, what I'm saying is, yes, Queen! Thank you for listening. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on Elizabeth. And as always, thank you for your continued support of this podcast. If you have enjoyed this podcast and you want to take a moment to help this podcast grow, you could tell your friends and family about this podcast. You could leave a rating or review wherever you found this podcast. And if you want to help share this podcast and get it out there, you could find me on social media. I am at Verbal Diorama on all of the social medias. And you can like posts on social media, you can share posts, you can comment on posts. Every little helps in spreading the word of this podcast. And if you like this episode on Elizabeth, you might also like episode 252 on Shakespeare in Love. It is a drastically different movie in every respect, but it's also got Elizabeth I in it, and it is the legendary Dame Judi Dench, so why would you not? So, the next episode, Elizabeth, the Queen, is definitely a template for modern women. But it's also really hard to make a true story when your subject is long past. So how about another absolute badass with a true story who was still alive to not only consult on the movie of her incredible true story of David and what's his name, but also have a little cameo in the movie too. Coming next week, the accuracy rate shoots up for the true story of how an unemployed single mother took down $1 billion corporation for groundwater contamination in Hinckley, California. The next episode is on the history and legacy and the 98% accurate, according to her, movie of the story of Erin Brockovich. I really love that movie, so please join me for the next episode on Erin Brockovich. And I always say this podcast is free, and it always will be free. There will never be any charge to listen to this podcast. It is not free to make a podcast, however, and I do rely on some incredibly generous people to help fund this podcast. You are under no obligation to join them, but if you wish to do so, There are two ways you can do that. You can go to verbaldiorama.com/tips and give a one-off tip, or you can go to verbaldiorama.com/Patreon and you can join the incredible patrons of this podcast. Claudia, Simon, Laurel, Derek, Kat, Andy, Mike, Luke, Michael, Scott, Brendan, Lisa, Sam, Jack, Dave, Stuart, Nicholas, So, Kev, Pete, Heather, Danny, Ali, Stu, Brett, Philip M, Michelle, Zenos, Sean, Rhino, Philip K, Adam, Elaine, Kyle and Aaron. If you want to get in touch, you can email verbaldiorama@gmail.com. You can also go to our website, which is verbaldiorama.com, and fill out the contact form. You can also find every single episode on there, and you can also see a little bit about me as well. You can also find bits that I do at filmstories.co.uk. You can find articles and magazines and all sorts of really fun things. And finally...
Lord Robert!
Your Majesty.
Will you dance?
If it please you.
Play a Volta!
Why will you not see me?
You must let me explain. Others will take advantage of this. You must not believe what they tell you. They are jealous and envious, because I am nothing to them and everything to you.
Do you love her?
No, I love you. I have always loved you. I was afraid of losing you because I was not free. For God's sake, you are still my Elizabeth.
I am not your Elizabeth. I am no man's Elizabeth. And if you think to rule, you are mistaken. I will have one mistress here. And no master!